Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 132 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is author James Morrow, who you may remember from our panel on being an atheist writer back in episode 111. The Washington Post calls him the most provocative satiric voice in science fiction, and the Denver Post has hailed him as Christianity's Salman Rushdie, only funnier and more sacrilegious. His books include Towing Jehovah, Only Begotten Daughter, and Bible Stories for Adults, and his latest book is called Galapagos Regained. So Jim, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dave. It's great to be here.
Okay, and so your new book is called Galapagos Regained, and you've said that the book was inspired by your wife asking you, isn't it time you wrote your novel about Charles Darwin? So why was it so inevitable that you would one day write a book about Charles Darwin?
Well, I guess it's inevitable because you should always do what your wife tells you to do. I'm known primarily as a novelist of ideas, which is the domain in which we sci-fi guys operate, as opposed to being a creator of realistic psychological fiction. Going back to 2006, I'd published an historical novel called The Last Witchfinder, which was about the coming of the scientific worldview, a celebration of the Enlightenment. And I managed to shoehorn some sort of intellectual content into just about every scene. I mean, this is a book, after all, in which the minor characters include the likes of Isaac Newton and Robert Hooke and the Baron de Montesquieu and Benjamin Franklin, and I wanted to do something comparable. The book, Last Witchfinder, had some success, so I wanted to try another historical epic that would also be a dance of ideas, and I just couldn't think of anything. Weeks went by, months went by, and finally my wife, Kathy, noticed my distress and said, "But Jim, ever since I've known you, you've been hectoring me about Charles Darwin. Why don't you write a novel about him?" And this was a kind of revelation. I think of that scene in the movie Young Frankenstein between Gene Wilder and Marty Feldman. Gene Wilder, as Dr. Frankenstein, says to the hunchback, "You know, I happen to be a very talented surgeon. I could do something about that hump." And Marty Feldman famously says, "What hump?" And this was a what hump experience for me. Like, what hump? Oh my God, I've been obsessed with Darwin ever since college. I'll tell you a fuller story of my relationship to Darwin. I said college rather than high school. An interesting dimension of the scope trial for me is a point that Stephen Jay Gould makes in one of his essays, which is that it was not a great victory for the theory of evolution by natural selection. It was not a resounding defeat. It did not bring the Yahoos and the Williams Jennings Bryan species of fundamentalism to its knees. Au contraire, fundamentalism enjoyed a resurgence, and the textbooks scoured Darwin from their pages. When I'm studying biology as a high school student, the text does not mention evolutionary theory at all. And I came out of that course thinking that biology was all about taxonomy, that it's nothing but the Linnaeus system of classification. You sit down, you memorize the phyla. Okay. The grand unifying idea was missing. In college, I happened to pick up a book by Robert Ardrey called African Genesis, which is rooted in Darwinian theory and an argument about the descent of man. He's grinding a particular axe vis-a-vis the problem of aggression, and he's very fond of the killer ape theory, that we can account for the fact that human history is written in blood relative to our descent from Australopithecines. Well, if I were to read African Genesis today, I would probably dissent pretty vociferously from that idea, but I owe a great debt to Robert Ardrey because I had never thought of what Dennett calls Darwin's dangerous idea. It had never been clear to me before. The idea of thinking of ourselves as as Ardrey puts it, risen apes rather than fallen angels. The notion that everything that is alive right now and that has ever lived and that ever will live is meshed in this fantastical tapestry, that we're all embedded in this magnificent mosaic of life. And that idea so exhilarated me that I started reading a lot about Darwin, most of it rather more serious than Ardrey, and less polemical than Ardrey.
Well, I mean, you mentioned you started doing all this research on Darwin, and there's this passage in the book I think gives a very different image of Darwin than maybe a lot of people typically have. You say that in his youth, he'd been quite the adventurer, galloping with gauchos across the Pampas, hacking his way through a Patagonian jungle seething with hostile Indians, and traversing the Andes on a mule. He'd survived a volcano in Chile, an earthquake in Concepcion, and the mountainous seas off Cape Horn, which had nearly capsized his ship. Just talk about like what you found out about Darwin. Did it differ from the image you'd had of him prior to that?
Yeah, well, we have this default sort of portrait in our brains of the bearded patriarchal Darwin. He actually doesn't make a bad stand-in for God, come to think of it, which is rather ironic. And yet the young Darwin was indeed this kind of Indiana Jones figure.
I think part of the reason I find this image of Darwin as Indiana Jones so striking is because I think to a large extent my image of him was shaped by that movie Creation that came out a few years ago, where you see him as sort of this sickly, moping guy trying all these odd therapies. What did you think of how he was portrayed in that movie?
Well, I thought that the movie left a lot to be desired. I mean, it's a good performance by Paul Bettany as Darwin, and Jennifer Connelly makes a pretty appealing Emma Darwin. It's based on a book, a nonfiction book by Randall Keynes called Darwin, His Daughter, and Human Evolution. The book is much better. And one thing, a liberty that the film takes with the facts, you might remember the final beats have Darwin presenting the manuscript to Emma and leaving the fate of the theory of evolution by natural selection in her hands. That he's going to let her religious sensibilities determine whether or not the world at large find out about this idea. And in the scene that we all remember, Emma is raking through some smoldering ashes, and we're led to believe that she has incinerated the manuscript. Darwin would never have empowered his wife to do that at that point in his career. He already realized that his scientific colleague, Alfred Russel Wallace, was on the point of scooping him. That Wallace had come up with a notion of descent with modification that mapped so precisely onto the origin of species, onto Darwin's manuscript, that Darwin's sort of natural scientific rivalry bone began to sing, and from then on there was no stopping him. He rushed the book into print. But of course, I mean, it turns out that Emma has not burned the book, and instead hands the manuscript to him to give to the mail carrier to take to the publisher. But I thought that was a needless sort of piece of melodrama, because the facts of Darwin's life are quite suspenseful and dramatically satisfying in and of themselves.
I don't know if you followed all the distribution problems that movie had. I think it had a really hard time getting distributed in the United States. I don't know if that made you at all leery about writing a Darwin book yourself, or I don't know, what did you think about that whole phenomenon?
Well, it wasn't the easiest job in the world to find a publisher for this book. I didn't follow that story. Are you saying, Dave, that because of the subject and because of the way Darwin ruffles people's feathers, that they didn't want to exhibit it?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I don't remember the details now, but I don't think it ever got wide release in the U.S. it was, I know they struggled for years trying to get a distributor for it.
Yeah, I only have it in the form of a DVD. I didn't go to any actual theatrical exhibition of it. There's not a whole lot of Darwin in the history of cinema, is there? I mean, like, from the golden age of Hollywood biopics, there was never, Frederick March as Charles Darwin, or, Paul Muni as Charles Darwin. Probably just as well, because I think they would have bowdlerized the theory and its implications. But it's a sad commentary that, there's still a kind of censorship operating, not unlike the textbook censorship that's still very much with us that I talked about earlier.
But you do think the publishers were leery about your book because of that same sort of animus toward Darwin?
I don't know. I wouldn't want to speculate on that. The publishers that turned it down came up with other reasons. But so I'll never know. I'll never know if they thought it was just too incendiary.
Okay, I mean, one thing that's interesting is, given that the inception of this book was to write a book about Darwin, that Darwin is actually a fairly minor character in this book. Why don't you talk about that decision and the actual protagonist of this novel?
Yeah, Darwin's a sort of the major minor character. There are scenes in which he's on stage. I think of the way I used Isaac Newton in The Last Witchfinder, where his spirit sort of suffuses the entire story of Janet Stern and her attempt to bring down the parliamentary witchcraft statute of 1604. In the case of Galapagos Regained, Darwin's spirit suffuses all of the text, but he's not on stage that much. And it's the story of Chloe Bathurst, a Victorian actress who's rather successful in her chosen profession, but loses her job owing to her outspoken political views. She gets a new job on Darwin's estate as his governess, not a governess who is going to mind his children, but a governess who's going to tend to his menagerie, the creatures that he brought back from the Galapagos archipelago. Now, in point of fact, Darwin did not bring back a private zoo from Galapagos, but the fine print on my poetic license allows me to imagine this vivarium, this zoological dome. The plot turns on the great god contest. While Chloe is performing her zookeeping duties, she gets wind not only of Darwin's theory, but of this bizarre competition that's being staged in Oxford by a hypothetical society, association called the Percy Bysshe Shelley Society. Didn't really exist, but for purposes of my novel, it was essential to the plot. The Percy Bysshe Shelley Society is floating a huge cash award of £10,000 to anybody, any scholar or theologian or philosopher, who can prove or disprove the existence of God. And Chloe, who's very anxious to pay off her father's debts, and is also rather anxious to get back into the theater game and to give a grand performance, she decides that she's going to enter the contest and win it, and all that she needs is to be able to exhibit the live specimens, the giant tortoises and these exotic and rare marine iguanas, and the string birds. She merely has to exhibit them to the judges while explaining the tree of life, the whole argument about the interconnectedness of all species on our planet. Darwin is scandalized by this idea. He has let Chloe know that, in fact, he does regard the theory of natural selection as a big problem for God, as indeed a potential corroboration of atheism. But he regards the contest itself as lurid and tawdry, and he wants no traffic with it. So Chloe decides she has only one alternative, and here the reader has to suspend his or her disbelief a little bit, perhaps. She decides her only alternative is to go to Galapagos herself and collect the very same illustrative live specimens. And hence the title Galapagos Regained, an allusion to John Milton's Paradise Regained, the sequel to Paradise Lost. So, for its final 2/3, the book becomes a crazy Jules Verne, Indiana Jones sort of adventure. I talked about the Indiana Jones sort of connection to Darwin before, and I very much had that in mind when I conceived of Chloe's escapades, trying to get to Galapagos and all the troubles that she encounters along the way.
Yeah, and I think we should maybe explain for listeners that who may not know that Percy Shelley was expelled from school for writing a paper called On the Necessity of Atheism. And so that's where this Percy Bysshe Shelley Society, the idea for this comes from.
Yes. The Percy Bysshe Shelley Society they're a bunch of rakells and flaneurs and sybarites who take as their hero Shelley, who was booted out of University College at Oxford for writing the essay called On the Necessity of Atheism, probably very much influenced by his reading of Lucretius, who was in turn, in his famous poem De Rerum Natura, was in turn celebrating the anti-religious philosophy of Epicurus.
Now, as an atheist, what do you sort of present this Percy Bysshe Shelley Society, as you say, as a bunch of hedonists? I mean, what do you think about that connection that exists in the popular imagination between atheism and hedonism?
Well, I think I'm just having fun with that cliche, because it's certainly not a legitimate critique of atheism. But I just thought it would be kind of fun, to have these decadent Raquel young men, with their tawdry girlfriends on their knees, believing that a good evening's entertainment consists in hearing believers and non-believers go at each other hammer and tongs, trying to prove or disprove the existence of God.
I mean, in this meeting we see of the Shelley Society, one of the panelists makes the point that God is never he doesn't heal any amputees. This reminds me of the website whywon'tgodhealamputees.com. I don't know if you've seen that, but I was just wondering.
Oh yeah, I definitely had that in mind. I mean, it's almost a deliberate anachronism, right?
Okay, I was wondering how far back that formulation of that argument went.
Whoever mounted that website is someone I would credit with originality. I think he or she invented the argument. I don't know its origin, though. I doubt that it goes back to the 19th century.
Okay, so you say in the afterword to the book that you spent 6 years writing it. Could you just talk about that writing process and sort of what happened in each of those years, or what happened over that time period?
I'm an awfully slow writer, and I always surprise myself by how damn long it takes me before I'm satisfied. But I would say, I see my novels as thought experiments, and if I set up experimental conditions that are fecund, I'll keep discovering new possibilities as I engage in the composition process. I'll be surprised by this or that plot twist that I didn't see coming until it sort of asked to happen. So, I guess it was, the truism for me is you should write the book and then do the research. It was a continual sort of back and forth for me between having to write the next scene and then read yet another book about Darwin, read yet another book about natural philosophy or biology.
Well, I mean, for example, before you mentioned that Chloe sets off for the Galapagos, but before she even gets there, she spends quite a bit of time in South America. Why did you decide to include that section in the book?
Well, I just wanted the book to be entertaining. I've always liked the truism that all art is entertainment, that all drama is melodrama. It doesn't work the other way around. Not all melodrama is drama, and not all entertainment is art. But I said, wow, I love epics. I love Jules Verne. A lot of the South American material is an homage to Voltaire's Candide. And I said, okay, I just want to see what happens if I put my characters down in that zone.
Well, I mean, like in the South American section, I'd never even heard of the Great Rubber War, and so I wasn't sure how much of that was your invention and how much was based in historical facts. Could you talk a little bit about the Great Rubber War and how much of that was your own imagination?
Well, I had read several books about Amazonia as part of the research, because Chloe has to find her way across the continent of South America after she's shipwrecked off the coast of Brazil. And when she gets to Peru, she gets caught up in the Great Rubber War. The research I'd done had given me a lot of information about the rubber industry and how horribly exploitive it was of the natives, of the Indian population. It's the mistreatment that's documented is maps on to the historical facts. Sad to say, there was not actually an event that was called the Great Rubber War. That's sort of a poetic conceit on my part. But a generation or so after the events in Galapagos Regained, there is a terrible conflict in the country of Colombia, on the Rio de Mayo, that does correspond to what's going on in the middle section of my book.
Mm-hmm. And in this section, they run into Alfred Russel Wallace, who also seems to be a bit of a Indiana Jones type character. Is that how much historical truth is there to that?
That's quite accurate. In fact, there's a sense in which the calendar of the whole novel turns on the fact that Wallace was in Manaus on the Rio Negro in Brazil in 1850. Because I thought it would be a lot of fun if Chloe ran into him. And Wallace, as I'd said, was himself an evolutionary thinker and was developing a theory very close to Darwin's idea. He didn't nail it until he got to Indonesia, but he's playing around with it. And so I had fun with the idea that Chloe, who wants to win the contest, the Great God contest, with an evolutionary argument, is very nervous that Wallace may have heard of the contest, or that he may be about to even enter it, or that he might regard his own notion of evolution as tantamount to atheism. And she's quite relieved when Wallace presents a kind of theistic version of evolution, like, yes, and that's in fact was the case with Wallace. He did have his notion of descent with modification. He did see species as transmuting in accordance with natural laws, with no supernatural intervention, entirely materialist, but he did give God a role. He did imagine the insertion of a divine soul into the human species. So Chloe breathes a sigh of relief. She does not have a competitor in Wallace.
Well, and this approach that you talk about of sort of saying that, yeah, evolution happened, but God, it was the tool that God used to create humanity, whatever. I mean, you label that in the book evangelical deism. What do you make of that whole phenomenon where you have, extremely learned people like Francis Collins, who they understand evolution through and through, but they still see some sort of teleological purpose to it?
Well, I find it a frustrating and disingenuous argument. I mean, there's no grounds for taking that position. It's comforting, I suppose. It's a pleasurable opinion, but it's simply an opinion. I mean, the whole point of Darwinism, the whole breakthrough, was that we don't need to appeal to any force on high. To use the imagery that Daniel Dennett evokes in his wonderful book called Darwin's Dangerous Idea, we don't need a crane or a gantry, reaching down and pulling us up out of the mire. It happened from below. And I think Collins and company trivialize Darwin's breakthrough. They're not ultimately friends of the theory of evolution. I mean, I can appreciate why many people regard Darwin's theory as bad news. He brought bad news back from the Galapagos Islands. But for me, the story doesn't end there. There's something exhilarating about our interconnectedness to everything that's alive right now and has ever lived and ever will live. I think Darwin's sin, the reason he makes people so nervous, is not that he killed God, but that he replaced God. He didn't just make a case for atheism. He also made a case for something that's equivalent to God. It just happens to be materialist. He replaced God with something that for me is far more magnificent than anything one finds in Scripture. Far more magnificent, complex, detailed, exhilarating, transcendent than anything that I've ever encountered in the zone of prophets insisting that their revelations are the case. He pushed the reset button on the whole of the Western psyche. He refreshed the screen, except something brand new came up that we weren't expecting. The Christian narrative that Collins is so fond of is beautiful. It's coherent. It's very satisfactory. But it doesn't seem to have anything to do with the world that we're actually in. It's about another world for which there is no evidence.
Right. I mean, and this book does feature characters having religious experiences and gaining faith and turning away from faith. And it seems in the book that people become more religious as the result of feelings and experiences and lose their religion as the result of analytical thinking. Is that sort of how you see the dynamics of those kinds of changes of opinion?
Well, I wanted to give the experience of the numinous its due. I mean, the one thing, of course, that is factual about religious revelation on this planet is that people think that it's happened to them. There's no question that people find themselves in zones that they come back and report as being mystical. I would argue as a secular humanist that it's always worth noting that we're never out of the human in such cases. I mean, you go down the hallway and you open each door that's labeled Revelation 1, 2, 3, whatever. And every time you open the door, a new door, what do you find? You don't find an angel writing in a book of gold. You don't find a cherub blowing on a trumpet. You find a human being telling you how the world works. I wanted to give the numinous its due, though, as an experience, not as a fact, because it is human, and I wanted to challenge myself. Can I communicate what I think it would be like to touch the divine, to think you've touched the divine? And that happens to my heroine, Chloe. So she's not a secularist throughout the entire story. She's sort of a bewildered pilgrim like myself. She also, though, is suffering from malaria at the time. And so it could be that the experience is entirely physiological. no one will be surprised to hear that that's pretty much how I regard, near-death experiences. All of these narratives of people going to hell, to heaven, and getting a T-shirt from Jesus, and coming back and saying everything's cool, infinite love is out there, and we're all on a trajectory to eternity. I think they are better explained by recourse to the neurology of near death rather than to Jesus. So, indeed, Chloe gradually returns to reality. I will imagine that some readers will take those scenes at face value and say, well, Chloe had it right when she thinks she's having an encounter with the divine.
I think it's interesting when she turns away from religion, she describes the experience as exhilaration mixed with bereavement. Could you talk about what you mean by that?
Well, it's, Dave, it's so hard to be a human being, right? I mean, I don't know anybody who gets it completely right. So part of me doesn't want to begrudge people their belief in the supernatural. The problem, and this is a whole other day's discussion, is that faith so quickly becomes political, and suddenly your loyalties are divided. Things that God tells you to do are not necessarily the things that your obligations to your fellow human beings would tell you to do.
Mm-hmm. Now, Chloe sets out on this mission under the assumption that Darwin's theory is what's going to kill God. But the book kind of suggests that the killer arguments really come from Greek philosophers like Lucretius, Epicurus, and Democritus. I think which raises the issue of, do you need Darwin at all? Or would rational people conclude there is no God, even absent an explanation of the apparent design in nature?
Well, you could certainly make a case that Lucretius did precisely that he ended up taking an atheist view, or certainly an anti-religious view of the universe, without having heard of Darwin, who lies many generations in the future. And of course, the whole idea of proof is it's a mischievous term, I think. It's useful in mathematics, but I don't think science is about proof, per se. It's about making predictions, coming up with explanatory models of nature. That said, if there were such a thing as a disproof of God, if there could be such a thing, it seems to me it would look a lot like Darwinian materialism coupled to the argument from evil. And I think that 1-2 punch for me causes God to go belly up.
Well, in the book you have Schopenhauer show up, and you have him list, I guess, 3 of the most persuasive arguments in favor of God. You have Thomas Aquinas' first cause, you have Paley's watchmaker analogy, and this idea that morality does not admit of a secular explanation.
Yeah.
I don't know, do you want to comment on any of those?
Yes, well, certainly there have been impressive proofs of God floated throughout human intellectual history. And we get to experience some of them actually quite early in the book, before Schopenhauer comes on stage. We witness the goings-on at Alistair Hall, where the Shelley Society convenes every fortnight. So we get to see the believers attempting to corroborate God through, well, the four big proofs: the ontological and the cosmological the teleological and the moral, the ontological proof being St. Anselm's notion that because we can conceive of a perfect being, such an entity necessarily exists because actualities are ipso facto superior to mere ideas. This was once a very satisfying proof. It doesn't work for us today, out of a sort of medieval mindset. The cosmological proof.
Actually, Jim, I want to talk about the ontological proof, so maybe let me just jump in there, because you have something in the book I thought was pretty funny, which you call the non-ontological proof. You want to tell people about that?
Yeah, that's one of the I guess a disproof that's presented. It's paraded before the Rakehells at Oxford. The non-ontological proof says, well, the only thing more amazing or magnificent, astonishing than a universe created by an extant, actual supreme being would be a universe created by a non-existent supreme being. That's even more marvelous. Therefore, God does not exist. It's a playful disproof. I think I got it out of Richard Dawkins' book, the God Delusion.
And in case you can't tell what we're saying, this is non, as in, not ontological, non-ontological. So it's a little pun there. I was wondering, Jim, have you heard of this? There's this philosopher, Stephen Law, and he has something called the Evil God Challenge. And he's written this article about how you can use the ontological proof to prove that there's an evil God, and that the argument is equally consistent as that there's a good God.
I think I remember talking to my son Christopher about this several months ago. He was running it past me, and he said that with Stephen Law's notion, of course, you then encounter the problem of good, right? Just as theists have to come to terms with the problem of evil, right? Are we talking about this?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's very clever, and I salute it.
There's a little animated cartoon you can watch that explains it, which is really good. So that's a first stop if you're interested in that. I want to ask about these three things though, because I mean, in terms of, I'll say what I would think, right, is that the argument that there must be a first cause, I just don't find persuasive at all. It seems completely logically coherent to me that a chain of causality could stretch infinitely into the past, and we have trouble imagining that because of the limited abilities of our brain. But it doesn't seem to me that there's anything logically incoherent about that. Any reason why there must have been a first cause.
Yes, I certainly agree. The problem with the cosmological proof, indeed, is that it begs the question of why it should all terminate, this regression should terminate in a supreme being or the God of revelation. And it also begs the question of, if God is the cause of all things, if God is the prime mover, then where does God come from? God created the universe. Who created God? It's a solution that solves precisely nothing.
And then this idea that morality does not admit of a secular explanation. It seems to me that when people talk about, people will say, oh, the problem with atheism is that there's no objective morality. And it seems to me that Plato in the Euthyphro dilemma shows that there's no such thing as objective morality with a God either. So it doesn't seem that introducing a God gets you anything. But it just seems to me that to divide up subjective, morality that's 100% subjective versus morality that's 100% objective is a false dichotomy. And neither of those is coherent. And it seems to me that the truth lies somewhere in the middle, that notions of morality are neither 100% subjective nor 100% objective. You can't look at through a microscope and prove them, but neither are they. Is any opinion about morality just as good as any other opinion about morality?
Yeah, I don't think it's a matter of opinion. And again, as with the so-called cosmological proof, it's important to not let the promoters of the idea slip past our guard. I don't believe in original sin. I don't think the default is that we are depraved, and that therefore morality can only be imposed through revelation. While it's true that Darwin understood the cruelty of nature and kind of looked at the suffering of the biosphere, he looked it in the eye, he also took note of the extreme amount of cooperation and nurturing that occurs. You could see those as antecedents of morality, it seems to me. So we shouldn't privilege depravity.
And actually on that subject, I mean, there's a part in the book where one of the characters has this fear about the implications of natural selection, right? Where she says, his theory now repels me, for I apprehend it will authorize the masters of the world to further exploit the downtrodden. Don't feed the starving multitudes, the Darwinists will say, for such misguided charity encourages them to produce descendants doomed to compete for increasingly scarce resources.
Well, of course, that's the famous disaster of social Darwinism. Although it's important to realize that social Darwinism was not the construction of Darwin, and is actually on stage in human history before anybody heard of Darwin. We're talking about the ideas of the Reverend Thomas Malthus, who thought that it would be a mistake to nurture the poor because they would just go ahead and make more poor people. So you cannot lay at the feet of Darwin that kind of a cruel policy.
Yeah, and I mean, it just seems like social Darwinism doesn't have anything to do with that. Darwinism is entirely about, saying that nature can act as a breeder in the same way that humans can act as a breeder. And it was well understood that humans could act as breeders, and that if you starve someone, they'll have fewer descendants, or if you kill someone, they'll have fewer descendants. You don't need Darwin to tell you that. Darwin tells Darwinism is, or natural selection is entirely concerned with what happens as a matter of fact in nature. And of course, it would be the naturalistic fallacy to say that because that's what happens in nature, that's the way things should be, or that's something that we should try to emulate. There's just nothing in Darwin's theory that suggests that at all.
Yes, exactly.
All right, great. So you, in the book, in addition to the scientists we've mentioned, you include some other scientists, Gregor Mendel, I'll try to pronounce this, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin.
Yeah.
Rosalind Franklin. Could you just talk about why you chose to include those characters in the story?
Well, the novel does have an element of the speculative or the fantastical. I mean, my roots are science fiction, after all. And I thought it'd be fun, or actually dramatically satisfying, emotionally satisfying, if on his deathbed, Darwin could learn that the pieces of the theory of natural selection that were for him missing, that he correctly identified as gaps in the theory, if he knew for sure that they were going to be discovered by subsequent generations. So I've got an alternative expedition trying to discover Noah's Ark as a proof of God, as a corroboration of scriptural revelation. And they're headed to Turkey at the same time that Chloe Bathurst and company are trying to get to the Galapagos archipelago. And one member of the expedition has to stay behind in Constantinople, enters a hookah den where hallucinogenic hashish is being served. And this has the effect of him being visited by travelers from the future. And they include Gregor Mendel, who discovered, founded, essentially, the science of genetics, and Teilhard de Chardin, the French mystic, and Rosalind Franklin. So the character who's there getting to blow hash with these three figures engages them in conversation. And they do provide the three missing pieces. In the case of Mendel, of course, we have his tremendous sort of counterintuitive insight into genetics. The fact that our somatic cells lead lives that are independent of our germ cells, and there would be such a thing as hereditary units that can dominate other hereditary units, and suddenly the mystery of why you're as likely to have your aunt's eyes as your mother's eyes was revealed. In the case of Teilhard de Chardin, while he carried evolution into teleological realms, where I feel it has no business, and where he kind of anticipates Francis Cullen. I think I see Teilhard as the precursor to that misuse of Darwinism. Teilhard was nevertheless quite an accomplished paleontologist, and was part of the expedition that found Peking Man. As I said earlier, to me, one of the sort of the sine qua non of science is its ability to predict. And Darwin's theory predicts fossil hominids, that eventually we would discover the skulls of our ancestors, not of our Neanderthal ancestors. People knew about the Neanderthals in the Victorian era, but going back millions of years. So Darwin gets to hear on his deathbed about Teilhard's skulls. And then finally Rosalind Franklin, who was whose work was crucial to Watson and Crick's unraveling of the structure of the DNA molecule, the X-ray photographs that she took, and also her interpretation of those photographs. It's sometimes forgotten that what James Watson pilfered from her files was not simply the pictures, but was her understanding that the chains, the phosphate chains of the DNA molecule, were anti-parallel, and this strongly suggested a double helix. Rosalind Franklin was famously and notoriously ignored and forgotten. Watson and Crick and Maurice Wilkins shared their Nobel Prize. They did not even mention her from the podium.
And it's because she was a woman. She was ignored. Is that? Am I understanding that right?
I think there's sort of no question that she was not taken seriously. If you read James Watson's book called The Double Helix, while it offers many fascinating insights into how scientific research actually progresses and what a human, all too human enterprise it is, he takes such a sardonic and childish and to be sure sexist view of Rosalind Franklin that you want to throw the book across the room.
In the section where Teilhard de Chardin is talking, he says I don't really know anything about his life. He says in passing that under some circumstances the Vatican would again be obliged to exile me. What is the story behind that?
Well, he this was a time when the Catholic Church was not reconciled to Darwin. They've done better in recent generations, although I think there's still more work to do. He was almost kicked out of the Jesuit order, given his passion for evolutionary theory. I think the Holy Office, which is the euphemism for the Inquisition, the Holy Office regarded him as a borderline heretic, because he, like Collins, and here I will give both Collins and Teilhard a lot of credit. They were quite unequivocal in their belief that evolution had occurred on this planet, that Darwin had nailed it, that the theory of natural selection accounted for the transmutation of species in a way that the book of Genesis never begins to do. But Teilhard took it into this mystical realm, this teleological realm, where we are a transitional species, which of course Darwin would have agreed with, but not in the sense that Teilhard meant it. We are transitional in that we are on our way to a kind of rendezvous with the cosmic Christ, and all human minds are going to meld. And the consciousness that we enjoy day in and day out will seem feeble, pathetic, a mere whisper compared to the chorus, the transcendent chorus of our eventual fusion with the divine and our union with this omega point that lies outside of time and space. It's very clever, and it's satisfying in a kind of intellectual way. But as I said before, it doesn't seem to describe the world that we've actually inherited.
Yeah, and I mean, and speaking of this conflict between the church and reality, there's this line in the book where you say, when the Bishop of Panama stumbled upon Galapagos in 1535, he thought he'd found the devil's pied-à-terre. Is that a true thing?
Yeah, that's the case. The Galapagos Islands are kind of an inverse paradise. I've never been there, but I've certainly seen enough documentary footage of the place, and I've read Herman Melville's long essay called The Encantadas. It's sometimes treated as a novella, but it's essentially a non-fiction work of Melville's, in which he makes it seem like a really bleak, lunar, desolate place. Melville said, the primary sound you hear on Galapagos is a hiss. The reptiles making their characteristic noise. Yes, it has certainly struck people as kind of hell on earth. There's a kind of wonderful irony in that. I think that what seems to be the truth of our origins emerged from this. From a place that could not be more materialist, in a sense, could not be more naturalistic.
So just how did you go about researching the Galapagos, and did you discover anything in the course of your research that really struck you or changed the way you thought about it?
Well, one thing about Galapagos that's true historically is that people were always trying to start utopian communities there. There was some notion that it was a paradise, and then people were subject to rude awakenings when they actually did attempt to cultivate the soil. But when I have a Mormon colony on Charles Isle, while that doesn't map onto absolute historical reality, there certainly could have been settlers from the Church of the Latter-day Saints trying to make a go of it. In that zone.
Yeah, and I thought you have a lot of fun in the book with this idea that the Book of Mormon is a really boring book. I have to believe that was influenced by Mark Twain's famous line that it's chloroform in print.
I'd forgotten that. Yeah, that's a great line. Yeah.
I mean, is there anything you want to say about your treatment of Mormonism and the sort of odd idea that the native peoples are descendants of a lost tribe of Israel?
Well, as I understand the Mormon argument, the Americas, both North and South, were populated by Israelites. That there was a migration from the Holy Land to the New World aboard barges, and there's not much archaeological evidence for that. Yeah, Well, the other thing that I will say about my use of the Mormons is that it does antedate the famous musical, The Book of Mormon. People might, in retrospect, think I was plagiarizing that work, but I definitely had written those scenes long before I heard of the musical, which I haven't seen, but it sounds like a lot of fun.
All right, great. So, unfortunately, we're getting pretty short on time here, and there's a lot of stuff in this book. I've tried to cover it, but you can just barely scratch the surface. So, people should go check out the book if they're curious about this kind of stuff. Jim, I did want to kind of have you. There's this section from Darwin's writings that you quote throughout this book that I really like. I just like to kind of include it in the episode here. I was wondering if you could just read this bit from the end of On the Origin of Species.
Yeah, here it is. Thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely, the production of the higher animals, directly follows. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved.
And you said that in one edition of your books, they added some God stuff into that?
Yeah, it's a peculiar edition of On the Origin of Species. That and this is probably of a piece with the discussion we were having earlier about how the Scopes trial was really not the beginning of a triumph for Darwinism, but really resulted in textbook companies being terribly afraid to bring this incendiary material into the classroom. So the edition of, and I just found this at a used book sale. The edition of Origin of Species that I first read includes it in its final beats. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet, etc., etc. So that's why it's been so difficult for this idea to get traction. People always have to drag God back into the argument.
Well, I think that it's an important argument, and I really appreciate you doing your part to, stick up for our side here.
Well, you're very welcome, and I intend to keep fighting the good fight.
So I think we should wrap things up there. So we've been speaking with James Morrow, and his new book is called Galapagos Regained. So Jim, thanks so much for joining us.
You're very welcome, Dave. This was a lot of fun.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to James Morrow for joining us on the show. Big thanks as well to everyone who's given us 5 stars on iTunes, including Eric's32 in Canada, and Marge1919, Alex J. Kane, Lilichka, and C.M. Fleming in the US. Alex J. Kane writes, "This one just keeps getting better and better, with informed hosts and guests who know science fiction better than any other podcast. But it expands its horizons beyond SF and fantasy on occasion, and includes discussions of films and comics as well as books, so there's really something for almost everyone. So glad that it's continued to grow over the last few years." And Eric's32 writes, "I don't normally listen to podcasts, but this is absolutely amazeballs." So big thanks again to Eric's32, Marge1919, Alex J. Kane, Lilichka, and C.M. Fleming for those great reviews. And of course, a very special thank you to all of our crowdfunders, including Steven Segarian, Bruno Onkier, Jonathan Pottle, Kurt Donaldson, R. Chris 4, Scott Osterling, and John Marshall. So thanks guys, we really appreciate it. To learn more, visit us at geeksguideshow.com and click on crowdfunding. Alright, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.